Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to 2nd Division's Professional Military Education series, hosted by the Cove and 2nd Division here in the Randwick Barracks Officers' Mess. This is an irregular initiative aimed at understanding and preparing at the operational level for the military contribution to whole of government efforts in the service of the nation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. In recognition of the wide broadcast of this event, I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional custodians and pay my respects to all the elders across this great country. I would also like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have contributed to defence of Australia in times of peace and war. Now, this is the first in a series of events to be held by the 2nd Division in partnership with the Cove and the Randwick Barracks Officers' Mess. This irregular initiative will aim to deliver events each month during the first or last week of each month. The schedule will move from time to time, so please keep an eye on Facebook and the Cove application and through the invitations through your chains of command. Each session will home an esteemed professional to facilitate discourse and thought on significant matters and concepts at the Joint Professional Military Education Level 3, the operational level of war. Each session will consist of a short lecture, an opportunity to brief a response from a different perspective, and it will be followed by a facilitated Q&A session to include those of you live here in the audience with us today and those of you listening remotely online. A quick note before we begin. The views expressed here belong to those individuals expressing them and do not represent the official positions of the Australian Government, the Australian Army or any other associated agency. My name is Major Jeremy Baraclough, currently working in Headquarters 2nd Division. I'm an infantry officer with over 20 years experience within the Australian Defence Forces in various appointments including 2 tours overseas in Afghanistan. I'll be your host today and it is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Deane-Peter Baker. He was appointed to the UNSW Canberra in August 2012. He came to Canberra from Annapolis, Maryland, USA, where he was the Assistant Professor of Ethics in the Department of Leadership, Ethics and Law at the United States Naval Academy for 2.5 years. Prior to that, Dr. Baker was the Associate Professor for Ethics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he taught for 11 years. His PhD in philosophy was awarded by Macquarie University. Dr. Baker served briefly in the British Army and served in the South African Army Reserve before resigning in 2009 at the rank of Major. He was the convener of the South African Army Strategy Research Group and part of the leader group for the Umvoti Mounted Rifles, a reserve armoured cavalry regiment. A specialist in both ethics of armed conflict and military strategy, Dr. Baker's research straddles philosophy, ethics and security studies. From 2006 to 2008, Dr. Baker was chairman of the Ethics Society of South Africa. He has held various visiting fellowships at the Triangle Institute for Security Studies in North Carolina and the Strategic Studies Institute of the US Army War College. From 2007 to 2010, Dr. Baker was editor of the South African the African Security Review, and Dr. Baker created the world's first massive open online course on the topic of military ethics hosted on the FutureLearn platform. In 2017, he was appointed to the International Panel for the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons. Now, not to be an overachiever, he has also written 39 book chapters, 6 edited books, 38 journal articles, and he has authored 4 books. Recently in 2020, and of relevance today, he wrote Morality and the Ethics of War, Bridging the Gap Between the Soldier and the State. Dean, you're a scholar and a gentleman. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very delighted to be here to talk about this topic. And between us, we're going to discuss this topic of ethical vulnerabilities. And I've been starting to think of it in these terms. It's human system and organizational ethical resilience. That's what I think is, for me, the really interesting question for us as ethicists at the moment, but I'm sure it's a particularly relevant question for you as military professionals as well. How do we get human beings, the system that is a human being, to be resilient in the face of ethical challenges? And how do our organizations help our individuals to do that? And that's, I think, a broader question than what we normally talk about in academic military ethics. We've become, it's a small discipline. It was almost a dead discipline until about the 70s when a book came out called Just and Unjust Wars by Michael Walzer. It's become, we've picked up steam, and we've become quite good at thinking about what the right thing to do is in various situations. But the next big test for us is, how do we help people to do that right thing? And I think this is the key question that we're going to talk a little bit about today. And I'm going to apologize for this next slide because it contains bad language, but I think it's worth seeing anyway. This is what we're trying to avoid. We want to try to avoid our people getting to the point where, as the meme says, they're all out of fucks to give. And again, I apologize for the language, but I think it captures that experience. How many of you have been in that situation where you're so tired, you just don't care anymore? Or you're so frustrated and angry, you just don't care anymore? If you have that experience, that's because you're a human being, and we all have those experiences. And what we need is to think about how we get people, or at least we can push that back some way. That's what resilience will do, is to push it back. So one way to think about it is through an analogy, right? Analogies I find useful. I'm fairly simple in some ways, so analogies are helpful, and that's obviously a picture of me after my workout this morning. But if we think about physical resilience, what is it that enables us to be physically resilient? Well, we all know the answer to that, right? It's about diet and exercise. And I think that's a useful framework to think about when we're thinking ethics. That we have a diet of ethics, but there's also this question of exercise. So I'll come back to diet and exercise in a sec, but probably 2 years ago now, I started to think about, look, what is it that we're looking for? What is it that defines someone as, if we like, ethically fit? What's the end goal, right? What do we want? And I think there are these parts to that. So first, we want someone who has ethical knowledge. We want people to know in their particular context what is expected of them, ethically speaking. In the military context, obviously a core part of that is the principles of particularly the jus in bello, that part of the just war tradition that deals with warfighting itself. But it's more expansive than that. But we wanted people to have that knowledge. They know what they should be applying. But and that's where we tend to leave things. But actually, we need to go further than that. We need people to not only know what should be applied, but actually know when to apply it. They need to have a kind of ethical awareness or ethical sensitivity to recognize that this is a moment where that concept applies. And they need to have the ability to reason through this situation and apply those ideas. So that's the second part of ethical fitness. But again, all of that's useless if they're not motivated, right? You can have all the knowledge in the world, you can be aware that this is a situation that requires the application of that knowledge, but just not care. Motivation is key to actually make it happen. And that, in the end, is what we want to happen again and again and again and repeatedly in the face of adverse circumstances. And that's what we're calling ethical resilience, or sometimes I like the term grit, if you've come across any of that. So coming back to the diet and exercise analogy, how does that apply here? Well, firstly, ethics knowledge, that's the diet question, right? And for you who are leaders, ask yourself this. What are your people consuming, ethically speaking? If you're not feeding them, that doesn't mean they're not eating, right? We're consuming ethics all the time. It's unavoidable. Almost every conversation you have will have some kind of ethics content to it. So, you sit in the bar, you complain about someone. That complaint is usually based on some sense that they have behaved inappropriately, and so on. So if we're not feeding our people on good ethics diet, to use that analogy, they're probably getting junk food, right? So think about what you're actually feeding them, or what they're being fed, and what you can do about that. So that's the diet part. But we need to exercise this, right? That's the awareness part. So all too often we think we've done ethics when we've had a sit down in a classroom and talked about ethics and tick the box and move on. But actually, for people to be ethically fit, they have to be able to apply this in situations, and situations that are relevant to what they do. And so the way that's got to be done is you've got to put them in those situations, in training as much as you can. In an ideal world, I'd love to see ethics almost disappear because it's so ingrained in everything that we do, that every kind of training you do has a kind of ethics content to it. It's just one of the things that you do without really thinking about it. And so that your people can be exposed again and again to ethical challenges, but not just be exposed, but have the framework to respond to those and have a language to discuss what they chose and why, and to have a kind of the environment such that you can have an open dialogue about these things. So I put on in brackets there the Quandary tool. This is something that I developed on behalf of SOCOM for their training, and Army now has grabbed it up, and it's just one example of what can be done, but it's a kind of a tool that's designed to help trainers think about how to design ethical scenarios to plug into training. And we can do more of that kind of thing to get better at it. So ethical motivation, well, that comes a combination, I think, of diet and exercise. In this case, the diet is what they see from their leadership. That's very important. But we are so deeply influenced by our culture, by those around us. That's a massive part of what motivates us or doesn't, or demotivates us. But then again, that exercise thing, right? If we're doing it again and again and seeing that this is the important thing for the organization, it starts to become important to us. And in the end, if we do this enough, that's where we get to, I think, the ethical resilience that we're after, the grit. So that in that situation, in that moment where that person is at the decision point that things could go terribly wrong, they make the right decision because they know what to do, they're motivated, and they've practiced it so many times it's second nature. So that's the ideal world. That's what I would love to see. So how do we do that? Well, one thing to think about, again, using the analogy of exercise, there's a trend towards sport-specific training. That's pretty obvious, right? You don't train athletes for it in some sort of generalized way. You train them for the particular challenge that they're attempting to live up to, or to the particular achievement they're trying to get to in their particular sport. So it's thinking about what are the potential weak points for your people in your context, and what is it that you're trying to achieve them. And one part of that, if you put it in a negative way, is recognizing, if you like, the risk factors, the ethical risk factors. And Jeremy's going to talk a bit about some of these in a bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I'm starting to think of them less as risk factors, as inhibitors. These are factors that inhibit our ability to make good ethical decisions. So often good people, under the wrong circumstances, will make less than optimal decisions. So what are those circumstances, and how can we prepare them so that they are less affected by these kinds of factors? And these are things that have come out in the broader psychology research. I've got a list of them here, and I won't go through them all, but I'll just rattle them off. So these are what I'm calling cognitive risk factors. It's a kind of an artificial distinction. I'll talk about social ones in a minute. But this is really thinking about the way the brain functions. So to go back to my previous slide, it's one of the key issues is that for us, it's our forebrain that exercises self-control. It's the forebrain that makes us do the things that are what psychologists call pro-social, right? When we do things thinking of other people. It's the most developed part of our brains. It's the newest, evolutionary speaking, and it's the bit that really makes us truly human. But when, under some circumstances, the brain just bypasses the forebrain because it takes too much energy, it's a little bit slow, and so there are circumstances that make us kind of just take the shortcut, and that's most often when we're in danger of making poor ethical decisions, because under those circumstances, we tend to react in terms of self-interest. And self-interest is good, right? We should be self-interested. When we're in danger, we react. But it can also, under the wrong circumstances, mean that we're acting in an unethical way. So these are the kinds of things that can lead us to acting in that kind of way. Combat exposure is a known factor. Stress obviously includes things like time pressure, cognitive load. Surprise is one. So again, you get surprised, your brain reacts quickly, it bypasses the forebrain. Visceral states, so heightened states like anger, fear, and so on are a big factor. We pick up cues from our environment. There's some really interesting studies about how just the very smell of fear, even if we can't identify it, will influence our behavior. So that even those kinds of social cues around us can affect us. Fatigue is an obvious one. Adolescence is an issue because that forebrain isn't entirely as well developed as it is as a full adult, and things like brain injury. That's just a few examples. But those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. How do we make people more resilient so that these affect them less? So I said I call this group, if you like, cognitive, but there's another group of inhibitors, I suppose, that relate to this image. And this is a photo from the original Planet of the Apes movie. And there's a great story from that apparently what they did was they got a bunch of locals to come in and dress up to be extras in the movie. And pretty randomly as they arrived, they either were dressed up as chimpanzees or as gorillas. So they start filming on day one of the shoot. They get to the first coffee break. These extras don't know each other from Adam, and they get to the coffee break, and all the gorillas go and have coffee together, and all the chimpanzees go and have coffee together. Right? We are so deeply social animals that it's a huge factor in our behavior. So understanding how our social nature, which is very often a very positive thing, can also be an inhibitor to good ethical decisions is important too. So again, I've listed some, and we'll come across some of these later on. In fact, I'm not even going to talk all the way through them, but these are the kinds of things we want to be aware of. And I do give what I call a kind of dirty dozen of these ethical inhibitors in my recent book that Jeremy kindly mentioned. And I should emphasize it's me pulling together work from other people, particularly a friend of mine her name is Deanna Messavy. She's a Canadian research psychologist. She's done some great work on this. So she also is responsible for the Canadian Armed Forces decision-making model, which is really quite helpful. Some of you might have read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's really that sort of idea at the heart of it, recognizing that we make decisions, including our ethical decisions, in two main kinds of ways. We make deliberate decisions where we kind of stop and think and work out what to do, but most of the time actually we do intuitive things. We just kind of go, because life would be too short to stop and think about which is the best pair of socks to put on out of these three identical pairs and so on. So we just make decisions. Now, we are most able to influence the deliberate way of thinking, that other track, that secondary track. But what my intuition is, the more we do that, the more that's going to influence the intuitive track. So that's what we're trying to do, is trying to build up that resilience. So in terms of the diet, I think it's helpful to have a fairly clear and straightforward framework, and again, a dialogue or a language that we can use when we're talking about these things. And I've come up with 3 tools. They're not mine, I didn't invent them, but I think these are 3 that are really useful in terms of thinking about the way we approach ethical questions. One is what I call ethical triangulation. It really reflects the way most applied ethicists do what they do. They don't necessarily put it in these explicit terms, but it's, in a sense, looking at a problem through the 3 main lenses of ethical theory. And it's the value of it is, I think it helps us to avoid overlooking key pitfalls that each of those individual theories have inherently in them. But what I think is useful to recognize about the ethical triangulation is it also matches up to the specific ethics of the profession. I'll try to show that in a second. So talking of the profession, I use these little acronyms to try and remember them. One is what I use an acronym of DISPRIN, and these are the 3 points of what's called the jus in bello, that part of the just war tradition which is about the ethics of war fighting. Just 3 points: discrimination, proportionality, and necessity. Right? DISPRIN. Those in turn link into the ethics of going to war, which is the jus ad bellum. But in a way, we can see And that's not, the military professional's decision, but we can actually see that as a kind of an expanded version of those three initial points. So to try and show how this ties together, think about the first one, right? The first thing we think about is, what are my constraints? What are my constraints, if we add commitments as well? What are my constraints and commitments? Well, as a military professional, the core of the military profession is the first key constraint of the jus in bello, which is the principle of discrimination. As a military professional, you have a unique permission that no other profession has, and that is the permission to kill the enemy in combat. Nobody else has that permission, and that's at the heart of the principle of discrimination. But it's a permission and a constraint at the same time. It constrains you not to use lethal force against those who are not enemy combatants. Well, that's the first step there, right? Those are my constraints. I must use force in a discriminate way. Well, this ties up for the state the idea of just cause and legitimate authority. What is it that gives the state the permission to go to war? That they have a just cause, that they've been attacked, that they are a legitimate authority, that they are the head of state, for example. Those are key permissions and act as constraints where those are not in place. Then we think about the consequences involved. Okay, I have this permission, but do those consequences in some way mitigate or change that permission? So in the case of the jus in bello, for military practitioners, the question is, I might have a permission to kill the enemy, but I have to do that within limitations, right? So the first one of those is the principle of proportionality. I've got to use force proportionately. I can't cause excessive collateral damage beyond what is necessary to achieve my ends. And that's a limitation on that permission. So I may be targeting enemy combatants. That's entirely acceptable. But if in so doing I cause unnecessary death and destruction to non-combatants, then I should hold back. Likewise, necessity. Again, I have a right to kill enemy combatants, but only if it's necessary to achieve a legitimate military end. If killing them achieves nothing, then I've just added to unnecessary harm coming out of war, and so that should be a constraint on me. At the level of the state, that same principle applies. Yes, we may have a right to go to war if we have a just cause, we have the legitimate authority, but is war going to be proportionate in this case? War is destructive and terrible. We have to weigh that against it. Is it the last resort? Is there something else we could do? And so on. Do we have likelihood of success? So they kind of tie up. Then we have the question of character. And this is how we often think about ethics in the military context. It's about acting on good character, and I think that's definitely a key part of the answer. That doesn't translate quite as well into these others, but we have this principle of humanity, which is part of certainly the legal discussion of the jus in bello. This idea that we are human beings and we are to act with humanity, and that ties, I think, to the idea of right intention for the state. So just some examples of 3 tools that I think are useful in terms of that diet that we should be feeding our people. So stepping back a bit, I wanted to just also flag up a few organizational issues that can become a source of maybe not causing ethical problems, but that can perhaps allow for ethical problems to crop up. And this one is, I learned about it some years ago. I was a visiting fellow at the US Army War College, and there was a gentleman there at the time called Lenny Wong, Colonel Leonard Wong, who's a retired colonel at the time. He was given a task to look into the question of innovation in the US Army. What is it that's holding the Army back from being innovative? And so one of the things he did was get a bunch of the students at the War College to look into what all the mandatory training is in the US Army. And they came up with a list. And what they found was that there were 297 days of mandatory training for Army units out of 256 days available in the year, right? So he realized pretty quickly, okay, yes, this is probably stifling innovation, but it's more than that because it's an ethical problem. Because the ethical problem comes when you realize that all of the units in the US Army were saying that they had achieved all of these mandatory training days. They'd actually done them, which is impossible. And so he wrote this study called Lying to Ourselves. And he would go around the army and say, well, you're a bunch of liars. And that wasn't very popular at the time. But it makes the point, right, that organizationally we can set people up to fail. And there's a whole literature on this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just to quote one of the key figures, here are some of the key figures, the key issues that are important for ethical behavior in organizations. Clarity of rules. These are so obvious when you see them listed, and yet they make a huge difference. Ethical role modeling by leaders. Yes, it does actually matter. It does actually work. Feasibility. Again, that's the example that I gave of the Lying to Ourselves study. It wasn't possible to achieve these ends, and so people make a plan. They work around it, and you end up with a situation of people behaving unethically. Supportability. Are you able to support people in doing what they need to do? Is it transparent? Do they know why? Do we know what other people are doing and why? Discussability. You say your door is always open. Is it? Can they actually get in and talk to you? And just general reinforcement of ethical behavior, right? What does it actually look like in your environment? Is this reinforced again and again? This is what we expect. So that's another quote from Deanna Mesavie, one of her publications. So that's one of the areas that we can look at. And again, this is a very quick run through of some things. Another area to consider is the risk that leaders will themselves end up in situations of unethical behavior or be the cause of unethical situations. A friend of mine recently retired from the US Naval War College after a very long and distinguished career in the US as an ethicist. He worked for every service of the military, and he was pulled in not that long ago, a few years ago, to the admiral. He was working for the Navy at the time, saying, I need you to look into this problem we're having. As things are, we're firing a Navy captain, a captain of a ship, almost every week. What is going wrong, right? I need you to look into it. So he went and he looked at their records. Can we pick out what's gone wrong with these people? Well, no, because they didn't get to those situations without being very good officers, right? They were successful officers. They'd done the right thing. So what was going wrong? And he stumbled across some literature that came out of the business ethics world that gave him his answer. And it's a thing called the Bathsheba syndrome. This is a biblical story. It goes back to David in the Bible. David was, of course, this very successful leader of Israel. He was the king who really got Israel places. Everything was going well, but then things went terribly wrong. And here's the story, if you're not familiar with it. So David has been winning all these battles for his people, and he decides, you know what, we've been pretty successful. I'm just going to ease off a little bit. I'll stay at the palace and let my army fight without me. They're perfectly capable of doing that. He stays back at the palace, and he finds himself walking around on the rooftops, and he looks down, and he sees this woman, and she's bathing, so she's naked. And David, in his mind, falls in love with her. Probably wasn't love. But he decides then and there he has to have this woman. So he sends one of his servants to find out who she is. She's Bathsheba. Problem is, she's married. So he has a problem. So he's like, okay, well, who's her husband? Actually, it's, well, one of our best warriors. He's at the front right now. So he's like, oh, so if he's dead, she'll be available. So he sends a message to his commanders and says, put him at the front of the battle. He's one of our best. Let's make sure he leads. Problem is he keeps surviving. But eventually, he manages to get him killed off. And, of course, things go wrong for David after that. So the point of the story is these scholars looked at the situation that he was in and identified a number of factors that are actually quite common with leaders who end up in unethical behaviors. And I don't know if you can read that, because I don't think I can. There you go. That's easier. Firstly, the ethical failure of powerful leaders is often not the result of an individual's low morale, but the byproduct of success. That weirdly, being successful is what leads you into these situations. Secondly, complacency and loss of focus, right? David being the example of that. Privileged access to objects, information, or people. So you're in a position where you have a degree of power, increasingly unrestrained control of organizational resources, because you get to say what happens, and that results over time in an inflated belief in personal ability to manipulate outcomes. And my colleague found that this was a particular risk for captains of ships, because when you are the captain of a ship, you are like God. There is nobody looking over your shoulder. You have complete control over all of these people under you, and absolute power. So that's where this seemed to have been coming about. Interestingly, there's been some reasonably recent research that suggests this is not just a story from the Bible. The research shows that powerful people actually, that they've done brain imaging, their brains change, that it looks like a kind of brain damage. And what happens is you have less need to reflect off other people and to pick up their cues, and you become kind of blind to them, and you become detached from them in that kind of way. So there's research like that supports this. And so what do we do, right? What do we do? I think for me, and we can discuss this at the end, but I think for me, one of the most useful things that we can do is have circuit breakers. So whether it's for the leader or for the organization as a whole, I think one of the images that I find helpful is think about your group, with your unit, your social group, as being a bit like a bunch of people in a submarine. Right? When you're in a submarine, everything around you is in a kind of fixed position away from where you are. Everything looks like it's standing still. You don't realize when the submarine is drifting. Right? There are no windows to look out of to get your bearings, and so drift, you just don't notice it. And that's the biggest risk for organizations and leaders. And one of the best things we can do is find circuit breakers. That may be a person, someone you trust, who's an outsider, who's not in that group, who can come in and go, do you realize you're doing this? Perhaps you need to rethink it, right? We're also developing a tool that we hope will have something like that effect, perhaps not as effectively, a kind of a checklist that where you can, as a leader, stop and go, actually, yeah, I see there are some risk factors here that I haven't actually realized had happened, because it happens slowly over time. So think about that. What are the circuit breakers that you can implement to help you to see when things are starting to drift? So just in closing, just to talk about some of my thoughts for future research, I think one of the things that struck me is, as I've looked into this, how little of it has actually been studied in the military context. So a lot of this information we have comes from the broader psychological research. But again, what we really are interested in is what are the challenges that military people face in their particular contexts? And we haven't done enough of that research. So, we talk about ethical decision-making models. So there was quite a debate over the ethical decision-making model in the ethics doctrine. And during the debate, I realized we just don't know. We're talking about what model is going to be more effective, but we have no way of deciding. We have actually no way of measuring as yet what is an effective ethical decision-making model. So that's an area of research that we need to look into. We need to think about to better understand what are those factors that in the back of our mind, those cues, those environmental things that affect us that we don't recognize. What are they for military people? So in the broader research, there's lots of evidence, for example, that if you are walking down a street where there's graffiti on the walls, you're much more likely to litter, right? That subconsciously we see those kinds of norm violations as permissions to violate other norms. Well, what does that look like in the military context? And what can we do about it? We really need to start digging in and doing some more research in that direction. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there'll be questions, but I'll hand over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Dean. I'll briefly cover off on very similar ground to what Dean's just covered from a slightly different perspective. So you will see some echoes, but that's deliberate. I will recommend to you, check out the Cove, where I recently posted an article on a very similar topic about how we look at these ethical vulnerabilities and what is an organisation and the leadership of that organisation that we can potentially consider as we go through it. The two references that are key for my thinking on these sorts of things is On the left-hand side there, we've got a recent article by Tim McDermott where we needed to talk about Marine A. So that's in reference to Sergeant Blackman, the event itself, and also the repercussions of it afterwards. And the second, if you see on the screen on the right there, is Black Hearts. So it's an experience of one platoon from a storied US regiment and how they essentially descended into a point of madness during their experiences within Iraq. There will be an opportunity for the outstations to prompt some questions, and we'll put the number up on the screen in a moment, and we will engage you as we go. But to go through the points, decentralisation, and I came to these points, sorry, to step back, I came to these points in conversations with Major General Ewan Murchison, and he and I met in Afghanistan. It was his second time around there, and his previous tour had been in command of Sergeant Blackman's unit just before he had committed those war crimes. So it was really interesting getting his reflections on those events and what he took away from the organisational climate and the leadership climate. And part of the problem there, one of his first reflections was decentralisation. So the military is inherently a centralised organisation, as you can see on the diagram on the right there, where there's usually a central core where those authorities' decisions are held, and that creates a nice unity of command. But when we start getting decentralised, where authorities and risks and the centres of power start getting split. And the problem there is that once it gets decentralised, there's a loss of incentive for leaders to be able to monitor the subordinates' actions. Not that that's accusatory or anything like that, it's just that informal practices can subvert the established formal structures. And unfortunately, that's where you can have those sorts of things getting concealed from the formal leadership. And therefore, what that can lead to is an organisation's purpose and actions be corrupted, where the ownership is completely separated from the control. Divisions. Because tribalism, it will tear at great unions no matter how good they are, and tribalism can never be a good thing. Where we create an us and them, it's a real and constant issue in politics, social groups, everything through armed conflict, and military being military, we have a great number of divisions and distinctions. Army, Navy, Air Force, those who have deployed, those who have not deployed, conventional, special, officers versus enlisted. We are at risk of having divided areas because cultures, they inherently possess perspectives and biases that can ascribe suspicion and miscalculate the reasoning of the others. And you may even see that in just listening to Dean talk and I talk. He will come at it from a very academic perspective, and I will look at things very practically because I'm an infantry guy and I like to get things straightforward and simple. Deprivation. Deprivation, it can be real or perceived, and the easiest way I explain it is big brother and little brother being jealous of one another because someone has something that the other does not. It doesn't have to be a real deprivation, it can be an assumed, and it can motivate people to act when they have a reasonable expectation of bettering their own circumstances. It describes a mismatch between people's expectations and what they experience as their reality. When they have no expectation of improvement, they've got no motivation to act. But where there is some sort of gap in expectation where they could see some benefit or betterment of their position, then perhaps they are motivated to act. Something else we face often in the military is disempowerment. That's when the situation is that confusing, and I'm sure, if you think about Afghanistan, you're probably familiar with this slide. Described by General McChrystal as if we understand this, then we can win the war. Disempowerment can just mean confusion of the objectives. It's when we have professional standards and we're being asked to do something and we don't quite understand what to do, or we don't feel that we have the resources or capabilities to do it. That's when we feel disempowered. When we do feel disempowered, that's where there's the conflict between the professional identity and there's a cognitive dissonance. And it's when the identity and what we've been asked to do diverge, that's when people are at risk and they're exposed to these ethical vulnerabilities. Desensitisation. This should be obvious to all of us. Violence and killing of one's own species, it is absolutely not natural and it is difficult to overcome. But the military history, it's replete with examples about how we do overcome this, and the society that is better overcoming it usually prevails on the day. David Grossman, in his works, he calls it operant conditioning, where soldiers are trained to shoot at targets with human images rather than bullseyes to make them more effective on the battlefield. Close quarter combat technique training, including the use of force-on-force paint rounds and other sorts of battle inoculation, we use them regularly to make sure our people can work under stress in a combat situation and act appropriately in a military fashion. However, this is not indiscriminate killing or wanton violence. Modern militaries do pride themselves on purposeful, disciplined application of limited violence to achieve a specified purpose or effect. But we have to do desensitisation training to overcome those natural hesitations. Dehumanisation. I'll just touch on this briefly because it is very closely linked to desensitisation, but it is worth distinction as a separate factor. It seeks to remove the barriers for the human to kill another by rendering the victims less than what they are. Grossman, in his works, he identified that the majority of the killings in ancient battles were occurring during the rout. That's when the enemy's backs were turned and the attackers were in the pursuit, and therefore the enemies who were being killed were less than human. What it also meant is, in Tim McDermott, he also pointed out in his analysis that during the counterinsurgency, it's very difficult to actually find your enemy. There's a constant grinding strain of that battle, which creates a sort of moral disengagement and dehumanisation of the adversary who is constantly attacking but without presenting a target. In the Blackhart's Frederick, he highlighted that some of the soldiers who were vulnerable and who were ground down, they actually used dehumanisation of the Iraqis as a coping strategy for themselves, because they felt the fear that if they did see the enemy as an actual human being, that they might hesitate in that split-second moment that they have to act in defence of their own countrymen. Lacking empathy or even recognition of others in human beings, it reduces the significance of killing to just a process, and it's an unfeeling act. So again, this is something that we as leaders do need to be taking care of and keep an eye out. De-individualisation, because anonymity, it encourages action. So everybody can think of the keyboard warriors who are out on Facebook or wherever who choose to make comments because they're protected by the shroud of anonymity. Leaders, soldiers function in groups as psychological weapons, and anybody who questions this, they need to go back and reread the studies of Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo during their studies. If you think of the Stanford prison experiments, and with the assumed authority figures. So Grossman also points to this, is if the authority figure is present but not exerting restraint, then it can influence the majority of people to carry on with actions that can cause harm to others. Grossman points out that militaries have leveraged this, and they often ensure the presence of a leader in a firing line to ensure that the soldiers do actually take action and engage the enemy. He also notes that violence tends to be easier if a compatriot is there or assumed to be there. Crew-served weapons and teams under visible leadership have a much higher fire rate than those who do not. This provides a diffusion of responsibility and a confidence to act derived from the support or the assumed support of others, even if it's a silent presence. And just as a sort of a last slide, these are two commanders of relevance, and I encourage you to have a look at them and consider, they do come at, for example, Sergeant Blackman's case with a slightly different perspective. These images are General Murchison and Colonel Lee. Both of them were commando leaders in Afghanistan in adjacent AOs at the time of Sergeant Blackman's act. Sergeant Blackman killed a wounded Afghan combatant once he was taken out of combatant as a wounded actor. They both had a divergent appreciation of the conflict and their part in it, and after Blackman's trial, Lee, on my left, he resigned due to his divergence from the organisation about what he believed should have been done. And it's worth further consideration. I do recommend that you do have a look at these guys and see where they went with it. They're both very worthy of exploring further. So what? So I'll just lift a phrase out of the Blackhart's book, and it's a quote from Staff Sergeant DM. He was one of the whistleblowers in the Iraqi case. And he reflected on his experience, and he said, and I quote, "When an organisation separates itself into small schisms, that's when you're talking about personal, intimate trust between two individuals instead of organisational trust. It's a negative leadership influence, but at the end of the day, if there's a moral, professional, more morally right organisation, you're going to gravitate towards that if you have it in you." So, in my own consideration, it's up to every single soldier, sailor, airman to do something about avoiding these schisms and doing what we can to protect each other from some of these ethical vulnerabilities and leverage off some of the tools that Dean's presented with us. Monitoring for markers of these sorts of maladaptive behaviours, they will help us protect ourselves and identify deviance. So this can mean watching our teams, watching our organisations for those 7 Ds. And as leaders, we do provide those touch points and those landmarks for reference, as do keeping engaged with our home front, keeping engaged with our peers, and similarly grounding as a group. So it's up to us to be inclusive and reach our arms around all of our team and those in the wider Australian Defence Force team to keep our standards as a disciplined and connected team, because of course there are no bystanders. What we'll do now is we'll open to questions from the floor and the questions online. And to get us kicked off, I'll do a prepared question on notice, if you don't mind, Dean.
Sure.
Given the recent release of ADFP 0 military ethics, what is the benefit of such a document, and how can we use it to help us navigate through this complex environment of ethics?
Yeah, so one thing to say about the doctrine is it's pretty much unique. There are, maybe not completely unique, but it's very unusual in the world, right? There are very few military forces that have ethics doctrine, and just that fact alone is a huge thing for the ADF, and something to be very, very proud of. And I think the value of doctrine is it gives a common framework that we can refer to, and a common language. I think that's really important, particularly with ethics, where you've got people, people come from different backgrounds, and the terminology they're going to use is different. Their influences are going to be different. By having a common framework, a common set of terms and ideas, we all have something that we can then kind of align ourselves to and kind of connect to as we talk about these things. So I really encourage you to use the doctrine. I know that doctrine is often not considered to be very exciting, but it's worth grabbing hold of, I think. Inside the doctrine, it does describe two approaches of ethics that might not align well with the Australian Defence Force, and they specifically single out consequentialism and ethical relativism. So can you briefly outline those approaches and what they are and how they might be different or challenging for the ADF to consider? So I'll start in reverse. So relativism is really the idea that there are no ethical or moral absolutes, that ethics is really only relevant to you and your perspective and your culture. And I think it's fairly easy to debunk that one. And usually I do this in a rather grotesque way, and I ask people to raise their hands if they think it's ever okay to rape babies. If your answer is no, you're probably not an ethical relativist. You don't think that someone in some culture somewhere would think it's, who might think this could be doing the right thing for them in raping a baby. Clearly that's false. So I do think we want to reject ethical relativism. We may not always agree on exactly what the right thing is, but we have a pretty good sense, actually. Most people have a pretty common sense of what is the ballpark for the right answer. And even across different cultures, the more you actually look into different cultures, yes, there are differences, but actually there's a lot of common core there. So that's one of the things that the doctrine wants to exclude. The other is consequentialism as a doctrine. That's a little more controversial. The concern there is if you take an approach that purely says what matters are the ends, what matters are are how the consequences come out. One of the acknowledged weak points of that kind of an approach is it allows you to do anything to get there. That there seem to be no limits on what you do to achieve some good end. And that's clearly not okay. Now, a sophisticated utilitarian would debunk that, would say that that's not what you end up doing if you're a utilitarian. But the warning is appropriate, that we never want to let achieving the right consequences outweigh any other kind of limitations. There are some things that are just wrong to do, regardless of whether doing them would lead to the right consequences.
Do you think that society's gradual adoption of subjective moral relativism is a contributor to normalised deviance of ethical standards within Western militaries? Or is the violent, enduring nature of war enough for the worst of human nature to always emerge? In any case, what's the ethical diet the ADF should develop to counter these?
Great questions. Look, I'm perhaps a little bit more of an optimist about the nature of ethics in our changing society. Australia has certainly changed in recent decades. It's become a lot more multicultural. I don't necessarily see that as a negative. I think that there are strong ethical traditions from all of the cultures that we've absorbed into Australia. I think the challenge is, though, making sure that they meet up. And that's where we've got to be a lot more deliberate, I think. We've been able in years gone by to kind of lean back on a cultural assumption about what is right and wrong. Most people came from like a British tradition, and everyone had the same sort of cultural sense of right and wrong, so you didn't need to make that explicit. Whereas I think now we do need to be a lot more explicit about it so that those different cultures connect up in the right kind of way. So that's one thing. And yes, the enduring nature of war, which is brutal and terrible and puts people in awful circumstances, is not going to go away. But I think we need to, we can do better, I guess. And that's where the rigorous research comes into helping us to be more resilient in the face of those kinds of situations. So I think there's work to be done, definitely. There always will be on this, but I don't think we're in a terrible situation.
What role, if any, does bias, both conscious and unconscious, play in ethical decision making?
A huge amount. That's a really good question. So one of the things that I think is useful with the triangulation model is the last step. We've got to think about our constraints and our commitments, think about the consequences, but then we do have to think about ourselves, our character, and that's really more about understanding our own limitations, our own character shortcomings, which we all have. One of the oldest and greatest commands in the philosophy literature is Plato, know yourself. That's really important. Knowing our potential biases is really key, because that has a huge influence, particularly unconscious bias. It's uncomfortable to recognize it, but for example, there's heaps of research that says that all of us at some deep level are actually racist, right? Or at least we are affected by race. It's really only through education and upbringing that the forebrain learns to outweigh those very deep and primal ways of distinguishing between people. And it's not just racism, it's sexism as well. So acknowledging those kinds of limitations and knowing them goes a big step towards ensuring that they don't influence us in ways that we don't want.
Since we're always consuming ethics and our deliberate decisions are forming those neural pathways, those tracks that will influence our intuitive decisions, how do we develop that in armies so that we can actually develop our people to make those ethical decisions, particularly seeing as they're going to often be put in situations, stress, combat, fatigue, like you mentioned?
In a way, I'm the wrong person to answer that question because I'm not there where you are. But I think ultimately it comes down to it, as best we can, making it second nature. And armies are good at that, right? Armies are good at making people do things just without having to think about it. That's what drills are. And it comes through repetition again and again, but also giving people the understanding of what they're doing and why. So and this is, I mentioned this tool we developed, the Quandary tool, and I was very conscious in developing it that I don't understand what it is for your unit in their circumstance to face that situation. I just don't. So the tool is designed to be content agnostic, but to help you to see, okay, these are the kinds of things that could be in tension with one another and that could lead to ethical problems. And so that's a kind of ethics thing that you can kind of overlay, I suppose, over your circumstances. But more broadly, the more we can make this just automatic and part of what we do all the time, every bit of training has some ethics discussion involved in it, it becomes normalized, and that repetition of this is how we think of these things, these are the terms we use, I think can only help us a lot. Thank you.
Great. If decentralisation is a risk factor and something to consider when attempting to avoid an ethical or cultural slide in an organisation, then how can we, as a defence force, achieve mission command without having a decentralised command structure? This question is asked noting that decentralisation was a key element required to truly achieve mission command. So if you want to have first crack at it, Dean?
Sure. I quite agree. I mean, decentralisation is a very valuable thing. We don't want to not be decentralised. What we want are ways to understand when drift happens and to be able to kind of stop it when it comes. And that may be, as I said, the kind of ethical circuit breaker where it's somebody comes in, but we need to think about what other kinds of methods we have to allow a decentralized organization to still maintain a kind of common ethical framework.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. A good book, I believe it was co-written with General Stanley McChrystal, Team of Teams, where he describes exactly that risk, where you have in his case, the analysts and the operators, they were having a conflict because it was decentralised. And then working in that team of teams function, whilst it was not centralised, it was cross-levelled and it was organised to be a unity of command, if not a unified command. So I hope that answers your question, Lieutenant Erasmus.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Yep.
When I first started looking at the issue of special operations ethics, I'm co-writing a book on that at the moment, found there's very little written specifically about special operations, but obviously decentralization is a major issue in that. And I found one master's thesis by a US Special Forces major, as he was then, who said something that I thought was unexpected for me as an ethicist. He says the point of ethics is predictable behavior on the battlefield. I thought, that's surely not the point of ethics. But of course, that's part of what we want from ethics, right? But we are able to get predictable behavior from our people in other ways through training and repetition. So it shouldn't be beyond us to do that with ethics. It's about having that kind of built-in sense of this is how we do these things.
The topic is the robotic and autonomous system, because some of us already start to interact with this kind of system. So the two questions are, the first one is, what are the challenges that the use of this system will bring on the military personnel? And the second question is, what is the status of the strategic level discussion about the use of a robotic and autonomous system?
Good questions. Thank you very much. And it's one of the big ethical challenges that we're thinking about at the moment. I have been a little bit involved in the debate on whether there should be a ban or regulation of autonomous weapons that's going on under the UN organization. So the groups of governmental experts debating this in Geneva. And what's been interesting to me is how detached the ethics debate has come from the operational realities in those kind of high-level forums, right? So there are important ethical questions, and we can essentially separate them into two. One are questions about whether it's intrinsically problematic to allow a machine to make decisions that will lead to someone dying potentially, right? That's kind of fundamental questions. And then there are, if you like, contingent questions around the capabilities of these systems. can they ever be able to be sufficiently discriminate in their use of force? Can we create an autonomous weapon that has a sense of proportionality, or can we artificially create something that fits what we mean by proportionality? Can we trust an autonomous system to only use force when necessary? And those are, maybe, if you like, technological questions that maybe they can be answered, technically speaking. And there are ways, of course, to at least limit the impact of those concerns. So there's the idea of boxed autonomy, for example, that you'll use an autonomous system, but only within specific circumstances. So think of, for example, an autonomous aircraft orbiting over a naval strike group. It's not going to come across many non-combatants. So a lot of those questions are not problematic, right? And it can shoot down enemy things that come in. On the other hand, something that's wandering around in a city that's full of non-combatants, it's much more challenging to ensure that. So I think that there are practical ways to deal with those, but the ones that I think those who object to autonomous weapons lean on most heavily are really those ones about, is this fundamentally wrong? And we do have some things that are banned in the international law, because there's a sense that it's not just that they're indiscriminate or disproportionate, but there's something fundamentally wrong about using them. Gas would be an example. Yes, it's indiscriminate, but nonetheless, that's not really what drove the international community to put a ban on chemical weapons. It's that the sense that you kill people in this way is just wrong. It's wrong in itself. So that's, I think, really where the main debate sits at the moment. I have my views. In fact, I have a small book that's just come out on this, so I'll leave you to. We can talk about that offline, but I don't want to plug my view. But I think those are where those questions are, and of course, related to that is the question of responsibility. If an autonomous system goes off, and kills destroys a proverbial bus full of nuns, can someone be held responsible for that? I don't think that's insurmountable. I think we do actually understand responsibility in a fairly distributed ways already for a lot of military systems, but that's a kind of an important part of the discussion as well.
This is an important discussion that we do have. It's important we protect our organisation for ethics, and I value the time that you've given us today, so thank you very much, Dean. We've all benefited from your experience and knowledge here.